Hi everyone, you're watching the virtual Amicus and I'm Lodha. So today's topic for discussion would be on startups and their IP aspects. Now, India has emerged as the second biggest startup hub in the world, and this has been achieved majorly with the help of students across the board from Indian Institute of Technologies, etc. Now, what is important is to understand these legal compliances and basics that every Indian startup should know or understand with respect to business licenses, understanding taxation and accounting laws, adhering to labor laws, ensuring protection to intellectual property that we'll be discussing today, and ensuring effective contract management. So joining us today on this session is one of the most sought after attorneys in the field of intellectual property. His name is synonymous with this field, and he needs no formal introduction at all. But because our format is such that we give a brief introduction about Amicus, so today we joined by Mr. Nirupam Lodha, sir, and he is a partner at Khaitan and Company. And just to give you all a brief introduction about our Amicus for today's session, he's currently a partner with Khaitan and Company in the intellectual property practice group in the Delhi NCR office. He assists clients, negotiates, handles complex, high value IP technology transactions, including technology licensing, acquisition, brand licensing, acquisition, due diligence, etc. He also advises and assists clients on intellectual property disputes, such as trademark infringement, passing off actions, paid infringement, copyright infringement, actions for misappropriation of trade secrets. And he's also assisted clients in seeking protection for their intellectual property, including by applying trademarks, designs, patent, copyright protection, and has also handled large IP portfolios of clients at both India and global level. Prior to this, he worked as a partner with Luthra and Luthra law offices back in 2007, and he studied law from National Law University, Jodhpur. So thank you so much, sir, for taking out time doing this really very important, very interesting session for us. Anything that you wish to say before we start with our Q&A segment?
Thanks, Jay, for that kind introduction. And first and foremost, thank you for having me on the virtual Amicus. You're doing a great job. I think you're touching upon all important topics, and I just hope to do a small contribution from my end. Looking forward to the session.
It'll definitely turn out to be one of the most important contributions, sir, that you will do to our channel. And so let's quickly begin with our Q&A segment, sir. And if you're ready, we can start.
Sure.
So, sir, when we talk about startups, now what are these key aspects that you're referring to that the startups should take care, primarily from an IP perspective?
Sure, Jay. I have been fortunate enough to work on quite a few deals involving startups, largely either being investments or acquisitions. And as part of it, we do end up doing a lot of due diligences on the startups, right? So just going back to the basics as to what are the important intellectual property aspects and why is IP important to startups. Let me start there. IP is important to startups, and let me take a Shark Tank analogy, which is a question which is usually posed is what gives your business an exclusivity, right? The exclusivity ensures that not only will you have a good business, but also the fact that there'll be no competitors in the market, and that's where IP comes into play. Okay, and to give you examples of what are the key IPs here, we are talking about patents, designs, trademarks, and copyright, and I'll just deal in brief with each of those. Now, patents is something you get for technology, right? And most startups these days are technology oriented, as we see, right? A patent is the strongest form of IP. It gives you an exclusivity to use that technology for a period of 20 years, right? So if us, but the important things for a startup to note is that you can only get a patent when there are certain criteria to be followed. And one of the aspects which damages your chances to get a patent is your own use of the technology before filing an application. So I've seen a lot of startups stumble on this, is that in the keenness to do business, they do not, look into the IP aspects at that stage, and we can relate to that. But if they had gone ahead for a patent application before actually using the patent, they would have been in a much stronger business footing as well as legal footing. So that's how patents are important. Designs are more aesthetic looking. So this would be important for companies which are into products, etc., where aesthetics matter. Again, when you register a design, nobody else can use that design for similar products, right? Again, giving you an exclusivity. Trademarks, as we all know, is the brand, and it's important to protect your brand because that's the value associated with your business, right? Which comes to the brands. Again, it is important for startups to take cognizance, and this is one of the easiest and cheapest ways to protect your IP. Would be first step would be to protect your brand by just registering your brand with the trademark registry. And then there is copyright. Copyright comes down to the actual content. Now, this will be important for content oriented startups. This is very, very important for software oriented startups, right? Because in India, the software is protected as copyright, and that's where you get your exclusivity that nobody else can copy the software per se. So these were the four foremost types of IPs that we can that I just wanted to mention, because these become important for a startup, and this will ensure that if a startup is able to protect their IP in this fashion, they ring fence their business against competitors coming into it. They ensure that they have an exclusivity on that side, right? And therefore, I strongly recommend that anybody who's starting a business do consider or consult with an IP attorney to just understand what is it that can be protected and what is the best way to protect it. The first foot forward would really help in ensuring that this protection is done correctly.
There again, so how the Amicus pointed the importance of consulting your IP attorney before you float or start your new startup. So that's the valuable insights coming in from our Amicus. So coming to our next question and going ahead, what are the key IP issues that you've come across, or any such issue that you wish to share with our viewers today?
Sure, Jay. So, like we discussed, as part of my experience on the diligence side, what we end up doing is diligencing lots of entities, not only startups, but well-funded and long-standing entities as to their IP landscape and how are things. So, again, going to the basics, what is the first thing that one would check for is whether the entity has ownership of the IP, right? Now, ownership of IP, there are two types of IP that can be there. One is IP which is created in-house by employees of the entity, right? And there could be IPs which are created by third parties which the entity has employed. Now, in a classic startup case, what will happen is when the founders come together, when they have an idea, when they have a tech in their mind, etc., they'll just come together, not have a formal relationship, neither a company or an LLP. They'll just work together, you know, just bouncing off ideas and coming up with tech. And in that, what happens is a lot of IP gets created. For instance, three people come together, and one of them is a technical guy who comes up with the software, right? Now and then down the line, they go ahead and form a formal company, etc., or an LLP, whatever structure they follow. Now, it is very important to ensure that the IP which relates to the business which was created prior to the formation or even during the formation stays and is owned by that entity, right? Because that's where you will have your valuation, that's where all the investments will come in, acquisitions will happen, etc. And to ensure that, you need to have strong written agreements, which we in IP parlance call assignments. So whether it be your employees or whether it be your even third-party contractors, you need to ensure that there are properly vetted IP assignments in place to ensure that the IP vests with the entity and not with individuals. So when we do a diligence, we a lot of times find that there is no IP assignment agreement. And in fact, the employee may have, or the founder may have today moved away from the organization. And things get tricky there. And then we have to find out ways to ensure that the IP comes and vests with the entity. So that's the bit on ownership. The second bit that I would like to touch upon is the fact of giving third party rights on your IP. So as part of your business, you would be giving licenses, you'll be giving permissions to others to use. It is also important that while you're in this initial stage of your business, you should not give too much away, right? So if say I today give an exclusive license to somebody, effectively I'm stopping myself from exploiting that intellectual property on other avenues. And therefore, again, when you're licensing either to your customers or whatever, you should make sure that the contours of the license are such that which make commercial sense for you. tomorrow you want to use the same IP in another business or give it to another entity, you should have that kind of freedom depending on how the structure or how the arrangement works, right? And the third aspect that I want to touch upon is using others' IP. That is also an important part. So far, we were talking about protecting our own IP. Now let's talk about IP which is belongs to others, and the startup or the entity starts using their intellectual property. You need to make sure that you have all proper licenses in place. Because there can be IP infringement claims which can come against the entity. A simple trademark search to ensure that your brand is not being used by that nobody has a prior right on the brands, that you're not infringing any patents, etc. And a related point here, because I touched upon software related aspects, is the fact that I see a lot of startups using open source software, right? And because that's the most easily available, and I suppose it technologically it makes sense to use this open source software. There are different types of open source software. One could be a copy left, and one could be a copyright or a permissive open source software. Not so a copy left license has its own issues, because what it effectively requires is, if you incorporate the copy left license within your own software, then you also have to, in certain cases, make your own software available to others, and therefore the software loses proprietariness and you lose the exclusivity, right? The open source software related principles and legal ramifications are still in a very nascent stage in India, but this could be a big issue in the coming times, right? The last thing, that while a startup doesn't have full control, but if it does the proper checks and balances, what it will avoid is intellectual property disputes, right? Getting embroiled in intellectual property litigations, which will just take its cost and expense and time away from the main business, but into legal disputes, which is something they can clearly avoid. So I think these would be my key takeaways from my experience and diligences on startups. That these are things that a startup can really take care of, and not only startups, but in fact to certain extent these also apply to any other well-established entity as well. But yeah, I thought it is specifically important for startups as well.
Yes, sir. And I think now that we've discussed the key aspects and key IP issues that you've dealt with, coming to, sir, where do you think these startups go horribly or terribly wrong in terms of when and where do they falter the most?
So the faltering, that the key areas that we've seen them falter is ensuring that ownership of the IP comes into the company, right? Like I mentioned, that employees go away or your contractors go away, and you then do not have ability to get the IP vested with the company. That's one place where we have seen issues happen. On IP side, the second issues that the second aspect that we've seen a lot of issues arise is on the open source side. Startups end up using a lot of copy left softwares. Again, that's a big issue. And third is ensuring that your IP is properly protected. At times, this idea of protecting the IP comes too late in the day for it to actually for you to be able to get the registrations or the protections, right? And therefore, at least an initial thought right in the beginning and a good guidance right at the beginning can go a long way in ensuring that the IP is fully secured.
Very well, sir. And now, coming to my personal favorite question, what would be your advice to all the young lawyers, law students who wish to build a successful career that like you have? And when I talk about advice, I am also referring to any particular literature, books, or internships that you will recommend. How does one, create that roadmap?
Right. I think firstly, if and I'll talk about IP because that's my focus area, and I can only provide some guidance on that. Is that you, as law students, I would recommend doing IP focused internships. You know, because I do see a great divide between the academic curriculums in courses at colleges versus the real practical aspects of how it actually plays out. And therefore, internships go a long way in giving you that exposure, right? But at the same time, do not discount or discard the courses. Getting your basics of law right is the best best thing that you can do at college, right? Getting your basics of IP laws clear. That's the minimum requirement that one would have from a good student. Then as far as literature is concerned, there are quite a few books out there, but from a trademark perspective, there is Wardlaw on passing off, which is like an authority in itself, a very nuanced literature. And similarly, there's Terrell on trademarks, which talks about infringement, etc. Those would be, I would recommend reading those strongly. Obviously, keep yourself abreast with all IP developments. It's a very, very fast moving space. And with the advancement of technology, we're already seeing NFTs, blockchain, and now the metaverse really challenging the boundaries of IP laws. And it's going to be very, very interesting, is all I can say.
Well, as so many speakers on the virtual amicus have pointed out that academics should never take the backseat. They should always be the focus point. One should make sure that first you are academically sound. You need to, focus, and you need to do a lot of courses. Make sure that your fundamentals are strong. Then subsequently pursue or strategize your internships accordingly. Now, sir, lastly, who was your mentor, if you had any, in this field?
Broadly, my mentors have been Miss Gayatri Roy. She was the partner who I started with at Luthra and Luthra. Mr. Rajiv Luthra, owe a big deal to him as well. And now at my new firms, I have my co-partners, who I learned from daily, and Mr. Hygriv Khaitan, who I have a lot to learn from, and looking forward to this stint. Yeah.
Fantastic, sir. So before we wrap this up, anything that you wish to say, any parting words from your end?
No, nothing else. It's been great being here, and thank you for having me again. And more strength to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for doing this wonderful session. Really means a lot to me and my team. And you've just made, talking about the contribution that you will make, you've just made a significant contribution, because startups and such a popular concept. And when we talk about the IP related concepts, the IP related aspects, the intellectual property, I think unfortunately that takes the backseat, and that is something that people don't really take seriously. They don't consult IP attorneys before floating or starting their own new ventures. All they care about is funding, the capital. But consulting the experts is so important, and that is what we keep reiterating and echoing on the virtual amicus. Consult the expert before you start something new, and especially when it's a startup. So thank you so much, sir, there, for taking out time for doing this session for us. And to all the viewers who are watching, our email is mentioned on the channel. In case if you have any of the queries with respect to any of the concepts, fundamentals, or guidances in general, feel free to write to us. We'll be more than happy to forward the same to our amicus. And thank you so much, sir. Once again, it's goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.